Right, afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our latest episode of the At the Coalface webinar series. This one is on fraud in football, the not so beautiful game, looking at fraud in football and in wider sports. Now, thank you for giving up an hour of your day. I appreciate there's a lot of content around fraud and financial crime, disputes, investigations, and so on out there. So to give up an hour of your day to come along to listen to us and speak and listen to Jonny is very kind of you. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Arun Chauhan. I'm a disputes lawyer by trade. I'm a director and founder of Tenet Law. We're a law firm that deals with fraud, financial crime, disputes, investigations, and compliance. We're a mid-market firm, conflict-free, deal with clients both domestically and internationally. We've got an office in Birmingham, but also in London. Honoured to recently have been recognised as Law Firm of the Year at the Birmingham Law Society Awards for the up to 50 employee category, amongst a couple of other awards. Now, the aim of At the Coalface webinars is really to speak to people on the front line of dealing with fraud and financial crime. And I'm really pleased this time to have with us Jonny Gray from Ankura. And Jonny, perhaps you can give a little introduction to yourself, and thank you for joining us.
Well, Arun, thank you very much for having me on your webinar today, and I'm very pleased to be here. My name is, as you say, Jonny Gray. I'm Senior Advisor of the sports team in Ankura. Ankura is a global expert services and advisory firm. And in the sports team, we work a lot in mostly football, but in other sports as well, around regulatory issues. That can be everything from assurance, audits, investigations, expert witness work, and so on. So right in the sweet spot of what you're talking about today. Before I was at Ankura, I was the global regulator of professional tennis, so looking at regulatory issues globally in the sport of tennis. And then prior to that, I've worked in and advising around football for 20 years, mostly internationally, but a bit of domestic work in the USA and here in the UK as well. So great to be here.
Great, Jonny, thank you so much. I think you're quite humble, actually, looking at your background and certainly setting up the International Tennis Integrity Agency, but a lot of work with FIFA and UEFA as well in terms of some of the most sensitive investigations in sport with Ankura, but also as global head of sports that controls risk. I've noticed also that I think the FA and FIFA are very happy to see that you're acting as the independent bid monitor for the UK bid to host the FIFA Women's World Cup 2035. I think the first World Cup we'd have here since 1966. Just to be clear to anyone asking questions, which I'll ask you to put in the chat for later, obviously a lot of the work Jonny does is very sensitive and it's wrapped up with NDAs. So he'll give some real world examples, but maybe not use the most obvious ones you might think of. And he can't talk about any of the PSR disputes in the Premier League, nor any of the work relating to the FIFA World Cup bidding process. With that said, just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Now, for those who have not joined us on a webinar before, if you register for this event, you will receive a copy of the recording as well as an ebook of the main summary of findings and talking points from the session. A feedback form will be put up towards the end of the session if you could fill that in about how we've done and what else you'd like to hear on. And always the joke is that at some point the lights go off in this office of mine and I have to wave my hands around to get the motion centered lights working again. So you'll see me do a funny little dance. Now, the structure we'll go through is, as always with At the Coalface, we're going to talk through 5 broad topics and then we'll have a Q&A and a chat at the end. So the 5 broad topics are: when the boardroom becomes the risk zone, why fraud and financial crime blindsides clubs in the sports and football arena. We're going to look at inside the fraud machine in markets fueled by uncertainty and betting, looking how fraud comes about. How do you get instances of match fixing? Where does the wrongdoing start? We're going to talk about whether sports clubs are the perfect cover for a breeding ground of money laundering, evasion of sanctions, self-dealing. We're going to talk about some of the investigation red flags for football clubs and other sports clubs. What are their response options if they do discover any wrongdoing? And then a really important subject, protecting rising talent, safeguarding and risks facing young athletes. What can clubs, what can their families do to help protect those individuals? You'll also have a few points put up in the chat from Paula, previous episodes we've done on At the Coalface on professional enablers, investigations from journalists and things of that nature. But let's get into it, Jonny. So when the boardroom becomes the risk zone. Now, I tried to pull together my thoughts about fraud and football at the start. And that's probably the most of the speaking I'll do is in this part now. And then we're really over to your side of the show. So in terms of investment, football clubs to me seem like a trophy asset. They're often loss making. I know we have the profit and sustainability rules, and I think in the Premier League, about 105 million loss over 3 years as a rolling average, 39 million for the Championship. But compared to any other market and sector, this one is driven utterly by emotion in terms of revenue. If you think about the people engaging with it, the customers, the fans. So success is not necessarily about the balance sheet, but the balance sheet is everything. When I think about fraud and financial crime, I'm thinking about risks in accounting. And I know Ankura do a lot of that financial analysis on fraud. So when I was dreaming up the webinar, and you were kind enough to agree to do it, I thought about, well, what are the buckets of fraud and financial crime facing football? So I thought there's ownership, source of wealth, ownership structure, offshore structures, sanctions evading, money laundering. I know we've seen reports about Usmanov and for Everton, Abramovich obviously from Chelsea. How clubs facilitate fraud or potentially be used to facilitate cleaning money. Could they be used as a front? I've seen smaller clubs, Northampton FC have been caught up in some charges. The sale of the San Siro Stadium in Milan and the prosecutions in Italy over there. Same club ownership, inflating transfer sales. Cross-border, there's a lot of cross-border activity, obviously, with transfers, third-party dealings with intermediaries. But then I think sports clubs are like most other businesses. They have a perfect ecosystem for all kinds of fraud, data loss, corporate impersonation. They've got ticketing fraud, retailing fraud. So, when you talk about other sectors and other markets, when the tide is out for a business, fraud tends to get uncovered, but the tide seems to always be out for football clubs. So why is it we're not hearing about more instances of financial crime and fraud and balance sheet fraud and fraud going through the finances in football clubs? Why is that not an issue, or is that just not being talked about?
Wow, well, that's quite a question, Arun. So
ignore the first part of that, just the question.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to get at is that you're right. Most, not all, but most football clubs operate at a loss, and I think the first thing to think about is football doesn't in many ways comply with the normal business regulatory sort of framework. I mean, but businesses on the whole exist to make a profit for their shareholders. And of course, that is slightly different. I was talking to one football club owner some time ago, and he said, you have to perhaps think of it as a bit like buying a country house. It is worth really only what the market is prepared to pay for it. You're going to invest a lot of money in maintenance and so on and so forth. And then at the end of it, you hope that somebody will pay you more for the house than you paid for it. So if one thinks about it that way, perhaps you get a bit of a sense of what many owners are trying to do. You're trying to buy something that is going to be worth more in future, but it's not going to necessarily spin off a profit. And even well-run clubs, the chances of getting dividends to shareholders are very, very slight indeed. Not without, it doesn't occasionally happens, but it's pretty unlikely. And you're more likely to get if you like, a funding call for more money rather than anything else. So given that's the sort of environment, you then have a situation where you have benign owners who genuinely have bought the club for there may be local businessmen, they've invested in the club, it's a community asset, they want to support it, they're at a stage in life when they can do that. Or you potentially have bad actors. And I think it's important to say at the top of the call, there are a lot of excellent owners in football. Yes. At every level, from local clubs right the way up the pyramid. And so we might, on this webinar, focus more on the bad actors than the good players, good actors. But I want to note at the top of the call, there are a lot of people who plow their own money in to support community assets and often get very little thanks for that. And maybe when they come to sell the club, they don't make that profit and so on. So not without its risks. But you are right. I mean, the UK National Assessment of Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing in 2025 noted that football is an attractive target for criminals, kleptocrats, and other malign actors seeking to launder criminal funds or generate illicit gains, and so on and so forth. And why does this happen in clubs? Well, often where you have people investing their own money, they do not see any need whatsoever to put in place the governance structures that one would expect to find in a normal company. So a board with different interests represented, non-executive directors performing an external scrutiny function, those non-executive directors perhaps potentially chairing subcommittees of the board, audit, risk, and so on. Very few clubs put those in place voluntarily, and the bad actor, a bad owner, is not going to put those in place. So that means that actors, the owners, have a very disproportionate power within the club, and many of them, as you mentioned some examples there, they use the club almost like an ATM. So you gave some great examples, Northampton there, and Milan, San Siro, and so on. But you take Reading, very high-profile example recently, where Dai Younger essentially borrowed 50 million pounds off a Chinese bank, putting the stadium down as collateral, which clearly that all backfired badly. So these owners, without the checks and balances one might see in place in a normal business, can get away with things. And I don't know the circumstances firsthand of that Reading situation, but whether or not the CFO of the club even knew this was going on, is got to be debatable. So a lot of these transactions, these ways of using the club as an ATM, are going on without the club and the officers of the club necessarily knowing that is happening. Now, that obviously not in all cases, but in some cases. So that might go some way to explaining why owners can be bad actors and not have anybody providing that scrutiny, oversight, and so on, that one would expect to find.
That's a really, really helpful answer, because I think, me included, many may not really appreciate those nuances. And I really like the analogy to the country house and the ATM. It's really about keeping it afloat, by the sounds of it, and operating. And I think you're right. There are so many clubs, aren't there, that are working for communities. But when you start to think then about the smaller clubs, if the larger clubs maybe might have a bit of revenue and availability to put in the governance structures and maybe a compliance program, ethics, and so on, where the smaller clubs are more cash strapped, does that make them a better target for some of these bad actors, that fewer percentage of owners that maybe are subject to scrutiny?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I think if you look at cases like sort of, with Bolton Wanderers and Portsmouth and other cases like that, I think you often, Leyton Orient, you often have people come in, again, sort of local businessmen who've done well, or consortium of local businessmen and others who might be fans, and they often might get themselves in slightly over their heads and miss. I think one of the things we get involved in transactions on football clubs is you find people trying to buy a football club who have got enough money to buy it, but what they perhaps don't appreciate is that the money that's only a factor. The bigger call on cash is the money to run the football club, to pay the wages, to make the transfer deals, and so on. And I think oftentimes you get owners who come in, they fail to understand that. They pass the officers and directors test initially. They've got the money to buy the club, but they don't necessarily have the money to sustain it, and they get drawn into problems. So they start trying to do creative things to create cash. So, we talked about the Reading example of, taking out a loan secured against club assets. But you've got those examples of, Portsmouth, where hidden liabilities in administration, often trying to keep the club afloat, but actually getting into bad examples. And obviously, Bury was one of the most high-profile cases of this, where accounting's going on. So it's not so much the owners necessarily in those scenarios using the club as an ATM, but it's getting drawn into dodgy deals, creative accounting, off the books activity in order to try and sustain their ownership, because they're running out of cash in a serious way. And I think that is often in the smaller clubs more the case than the ATM example, where people are basically asset stripping a club, which is probably a little bit further up the pyramid.
And when you have that situation, cash is obviously king into running any business. It's about cash flow. When it comes to prevention of fraud, financial crime, all those checks, it's a bit of a cost center. It's always the thing that it seems to you either drag through it because of corporate criminal liability, or you're trying to do the right thing, but it's the thing that gets in the way sometimes. I often talk about when we're involved, obviously, in fraud and financial crime and compliance. Often I think we're talking in an echo chamber, where you're often talking to people who also build up fraud and financial crime as an important subject, but actually in wider business, you wonder. So same when it comes to sports integrity, Jonny, do you feel that it's people who are in sports integrity are just speaking the right thing to other people in sports integrity? Are the wider business owners actually paying any attention to that, or giving it the funding it needs? Or is it just an echo chamber?
So just when you say sports integrity, because that means all sorts of things to different people.
Yes, okay.
If we're talking about sort of the integrity of the ownership of clubs, if that's what you mean, I think that there have been a lot of serious advances in the governance of this in recent years, and you mentioned at the top of the call some of the work that I and my colleagues at Ankura have been doing for people like FIFA, who put in place the FIFA Forward program, which really puts in place the sort of structures around disbursement of money. UEFA with their financial sustainability and club licensing rules. You've got various PSR, FFP type regulations in the English football pyramid, all around the financial sustainability of club. And yes, as you mentioned, the top of the call, clubs are allowed to make a loss, within limits over a defined period of time. Because if you're a new owner and you come in, using my country house analogy, in order to improve the value, you've got to spend money.
Yes.
You've got to be able to bring in players. You've got to get further up the pyramid in order that when you sell, the club is worth more money. So I think there's an understanding that ambitious owners, always supported by fans, will want to spend money. But that has to be proportionate to the size of the club, the ability of the club to carry those losses over a period of time, hopefully recouping that, within the sort of broader accounting period. So a lot of work's come into this. We get involved in Ankura in auditing clubs for compliance with these rules. Clubs have to submit their returns to the regulators, and those are audited by the regulator and may throw up yellow flags, and then the regulators may send in a company like ourselves to go and crawl over the books, to want of a better expression. So the governance is coming in significantly in this area, and that you combine that with, for example, the EU new anti-money laundering legislation, football clubs, agents, so on, coming under the jurisdiction of that from 2029, and statutory bodies like the Independent Football Regulator in the UK being set up to look, in part at financial sustainability, but also good governance. And I think we'll see the IFR issuing good governance guidelines, and I've advocated for this for a long time, talking about things like non-executive directors, codes of conduct, risk and audit committees, all the sort of things you would expect to see. And many clubs, the good actors, they've already put those in place. They are well ahead of this, and a good owner will want it in place to protect themselves and their investment from bad actors elsewhere in the ecosystem. So I think a lot of progress has been made. Clearly, a lot of lessons have been learned, as you said, at the top of the call. Some of the examples you've used, there are many more overseas. I wouldn't make everyone, we've used British examples, but Parma and Parma Lat, is another classic one of all this sort of going on. Barcelona with their transfer fees, Rangers and Scotland with their tax dodging, using the employee benefit trust to pay players, and so on. So this isn't just an English issue. This is a much broader thing. But I think the regulations are on it, and things are tightening up considerably.
That's really helpful. And I think, certainly from the ownership point of view, that's some really good points. And then you've got the manipulation of matches, the manipulation of the outcome. I think we're all expecting as a fan to watch sport and we enjoy it because of the unpredictability. And I was looking into examples of how manipulation starts. I remember this, and I looked it up again. Matt Le Tissier in 2009 autobiography, aptly named "Taking Letis." He talked about spread betting in a match where he was playing for Southampton against Wimbledon, and he and his friends bet up the time the ball would go out of play. And he got the ball, and he tried to kick it out of play, but one of his players, not involved in any of this betting, saved the ball from going out of play. And Matt Le Tissier, who wasn't the quickest and the person who ran the most, legged it around that pitch to try and get that ball out of play, to get it out of play at a certain time to win some money. When the police read about his autobiography, they said it wasn't in the public interest to prosecute, but it revealed how just an individual with some friends decided to start it. In cricket, I read a book about how it's actually the punters, not the bookies, who are approaching players to try and help them influence. So, for example, a no ball in an international T20 match 10, 12 years ago would be worth £3,500 and a match fee be worth £6,000. In your experience, how does it start in football or in wider sports? How do people fix the betting or fix a match?
Yes, well, I mean, you talked about some good examples there. I would say, if anybody on the call wants a more up-to-date, the Tissier thing is pre-app-based betting, and the world has completely changed. Moses Swabu, who was an English football player, he published a book this year called My Life as a Match Fixer. He went to jail for match fixing, and that book really sets out, if you like, the fall of he was, in the squad at Crystal Palace, and he sort of fell down the league structure until he ended up in National League South. And really good example of that. And the same, obviously, in tennis, we have the same problems. And normally what you have is a player who is not making very much money, maybe in debt. Tennis players, for example, they have to be on the world tour because that's the way tennis works. So it's very expensive flying around between all these matches. Competitions rather, and if you don't win, you're in the hole. So you're very vulnerable to somebody coming and approaching you. Approaches to players now can be really sophisticated. It can be dressed up as sponsorship. Now, if you're a young tennis player or a young footballer, and you think you're going to get sponsorship for wearing clothes in your free time, or you're these sort of things, you're very vulnerable to this. You're young, and so organized crime will latch on to players in this way. In Moses' case, it was Chinese organized crime, but in tennis, it's been recently very high profile Albanian organized crime. And they'll dress it all up, give you money up front, not ask you to do anything initially, but then they'll finally say, hey, listen, can you just get a yellow card in this match? Or in tennis, can you just lose the second set? Play the rest of the game for real, but just lose the second set. So you end up often spot fixing. You're not necessarily trying to change the outcome of the whole match, but you are influencing a point in the match on which betting can be made. And tennis and football have the most liquidity of any betting markets. They have the most volume. So it's more easy for organized crime to hide the bets, spread the bets below the thresholds that trigger alerts from the betting companies. So they will often have inside information on what those alerts are, spread the bets, and it's a victimless crime. It's very difficult for police forces. It's transnational and very difficult for police forces to really sum up the energy to try and investigate these things. So that is how it tends to happen. And once that player's done that once, then they are yours. And they, in turn, may then be encouraged to identify other players who can be approached, or even they become, and this happens in tennis with older players at the sort of challenger level. And in Moses' case, he became one of these himself. He became the organizer of the match fixers. and then he tried to cut out the organised crime unit, and it all ends in tears, and he goes to jail. So that is the challenge. Now, it's also, because it's app-based and what have you, it's slightly easier to detect. I mean, the old days it was all done in the bookies or in the grey markets, but now it is done to spread the bets. You need to be on the regulated betting apps and so on. So betting companies are very sophisticated in how they detect these, and where they do detect it, they will notify the regulators, and then the regulators will investigate it. That is indeed what happened in Moses's case. He was arrested by the National Crime Agency, and he and others went to jail for that. And in tennis, the body I used to run investigates globally, and will take the case. Now, you're always trying to persuade the police forces or Europol or Interpol to actually go after the match fixers, the organized crime people, more than the athletes. Because I often, and this is controversial perhaps, but I often saw the young athletes as victims in this as much as anything else.
Yeah, I don't think that's particularly controversial. I mean, there's all kind of challenges we'll talk about later. I mean, the financial literacy and understanding the wider ecosystem they're causing a risk for. But it sounds from what you're saying now that the current climate is that the sanctions by clubs and regulatory bodies is pretty strict. If you're caught up in this, is that career over?
It can be, and certainly in tennis, if you were a serial match fixer and we caught you and we proved the case in an independent arbitral hearing, and it's often quite difficult to prove it, because let's take that example, the yellow card or the loss of the first set. Yellow card, the player can say, well, yeah, I got a yellow card. And the regulator says, well, lots of people bet on it. That's nothing to do with me. So you have to show a link between the player and other people, other conspirators, and the same in tennis. Well, I lost the second set. That happens. So proving it can often be the case, and I won't mention the case because I don't want people to think I'm casting any judgments on it, but there was a very high-profile case recently which was not proven. So it's time-consuming. It takes a lot of time and effort and forensic analysis, digital forensics, and so on to prove these cases. So the regulators have a challenge there. And often cases can go on for years. I mean, there's an organized crime case in tennis which has been going on for 10 years, still wrapping it up and so on. So so the clubs wouldn't sanction necessarily. I mean, in the UK, the regulator for football is the FA, so it would be the FA bringing the charges, and the club may then, if the player obviously is found guilty, the all likelihood the player's in breach of contract, so the club will then take action in that sense, if that makes sense.
And you can see for circumstances with individual players that they'll be their own regulatory sanctions. It'll be being banned or completely forbidden, I suppose, to be in the sport. And for clubs though, I guess obviously we can't sway into what's happening in matters you're involved in, but the sanctions, do you feel that the direction of travel of regulatory and police involvement or prosecution body involvement is heading in the right way, that they're trying to improve and increase sanctions for clubs caught up in wrongdoing?
Sorry, just clear, we're talking about clubs and financial crime as opposed to match fixing now. We back to.
I'm probably not being too articulate. I would say both. I'm looking at if a club. So I've obviously seen instances in clubs, maybe in other parts of Europe or in other continents, where they've been caught up as a club in match fixing, or they've been caught up being involved in financial crime.
Yeah, so I think financial crime probably splits into two areas. I mean, there's the non-compliance with the regulations, which is not a criminal offence. Clubs overspent, and as you said at the top of the call, there's been some very high-profile cases in the Premier League recently, and there have been other cases across Europe and elsewhere where the regulator will take some form of sanction if the club agrees, or it'll go to an arbitration if the club doesn't agree, and the arbitration process will decide. And if the club is, if the claim is supported, then the club would be sanctioned some way. That can be fines, that can be points deductions, combination of the two. Obviously, where you go into criminal activity, fraud, then obviously the police forces will get involved. So you talked about the San Siro case, where the police are involved in that. I think that case is ongoing. Nottingham Town, I think 6 people have been charged with offences there, criminal offences. So that is sort of the two, and the same, to an extent, is the case in match fixing, where you can bring a criminal charge. Then the regulators, on the whole, would always want to do that, although it can be very time consuming. I mentioned the case from Tenet, which has been going on for years. Sure. So there is that challenge that the player is still playing in many cases. If you can't provisionally suspend them in some scenarios around legal cases, criminal legal cases, because somebody's innocent until proven guilty. So, suspending them from sport is difficult, and you therefore have someone you pretty much know to be a bad actor still involved in the sport. So, there are sort of complications around that. But yes, under the regulatory statutes, then players are charged with manipulation of the sport, and if again that charge is upheld, then they can be banned, fined, or combination of the two. Obviously, if as in Moses's case, there was criminal activity involved there with organised crime, then National Crime Agency led and charged, and he went to jail.
Okay, so thanks, and with I'm not a sports lawyer, I'm a fraud and financial crime lawyer. Yep. So it's always interesting to hear from different sections, from different sectors, and lots of sectors have regulators and law enforcement doing things around it. You mentioned money laundering. I know around the money laundering football, it's typically around know your customer, and here yep. It's slightly different because it's not really about your customer. But I understand they're going to look at transactions with investors, sponsors, football agents, and player transfers. This is obviously the owner-directors test, which looks at integrity risk. I think one of the questions which I can reference now in the chat is when the independent football regulator gets involved, will they look at probity and financial misgivings? I also did wonder about professional enablers, about those organisations, professional services that help facilitate clubs. Maybe that's on the misgivings about financial fair play and whether there's sanctions. As a sector, sports is obviously a huge sector. Yep. It's a very wide-ranging question. But do you think enough is being done in terms of making this a real centrepiece and heartbeat to preserving, the whole heartbeat, the value of this enterprise?
Well, as I said earlier, I do think significant progress has been going on. Let's take another example. I mean, I think there's always been concerns around the international transfer market and money laundering, agents, fees, kickback schemes, and so on. And the FIFA clearinghouse in Paris only doing the transfers at the moment, but the money has to go through the FIFA clearinghouse, and they're doing the AML checks and so on. And I think, and there've been some disputes over all of this, but I think agents are going to come under more the regulatory framework from FIFA. There's been a case ongoing about how much they can charge as agents' fees, and I'm not quite sure what that is. I'm not involved in that case, so I won't say much more than there is a dispute there. But I think FIFA Clearinghouse will move on to doing. I think it aspires to move on to doing agents' fees and all that, to make sure we don't have all these sort of kickback schemes and things that have been sort of quite prevalent between agents and sporting directors and those sort of matters. So I think those are improving. I think the advent in the UK, the duty to report legislation, how that is seen to apply to sport. And we talked earlier on about how owners might be doing things around the club that the officers of the club may only have some awareness. Now, Will legislation about duty to report change all of that? I think it probably will. And finally, you mentioned the independent football regulator, and quite in the question in the chat as to what extent are they, they do have a statutory responsibility for owners and directors tests.
Yes.
So it'd be fascinating to see what they decide to do, how they decide to take that forward. Those tests have been administered up till now by the the existing regulators, and it's challenging. We saw some quite sort of heated debates about the purchase of Newcastle by PIF, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. Whether that's national ownership of a club or not, and again, without wishing to be drawn too much into that, those sort of debates are ongoing. So, will an independent regulator be able to deal with the Usmanov, Abramovich state money coming in? How they do all that, remains to be seen, but it's going to be fascinating to see how they decide to approach that.
And I think we have to be realistic, don't we? I think ultimately, with any regulator in any sector, it's about how well they're funded and the resources they're given. Because, as you say, some investigations can take multiple years, 10 years in one case you mentioned in terms of tennis.
Yeah.
I know there's a West Ham fan who's put up a question, and I'm not sure whether this is something you've been involved in or not, so you may not be able to talk about it. But the Lucas Paqueta case, this is really about a wider point that the charges relied heavily on the evidence of a sole investigator from the FA, with the investigation failings having been compared in commentary to like the post office scandal, where the FA failed to consider, or said they failed to consider, a look at the evidence of professional experts. Do you think in this sector, regulators are learning from failings of other sectors and regulators about where charges have been laid, but investigations haven't been followed through a good process or recommended best practice? And is that something you're pleased to see, that regulators in this sector are learning from others?
I'm not sure how much they're learning from other sectors. I think they're learning from the if you like, the maturation of jurisprudence around sports regulations. And I don't want to talk too much about specifically the Paqueta case, and always interesting to have West Ham fans on the call about that case. I'm working for the FA at the moment, so I don't want to draw too much into it. Absolutely. But what I would say is that, and this really comes into some of the work we do in Ankura, is that where a regulator brings a case where the expert giving evidence is an employee of the regulator, I think that type of thing is increasingly open to challenge. And so a lot of the work that we do is as independent experts, where your duty is to the court or to the arbitral hearing to help them understand the issues, rather than advocating as an expert, what one way or the other. So I will see in the maturation of jurisprudence around these matters, more use of experts, more use of the sort of things you would expect to see in other sectors or in criminal cases. And we saw that to an extent with the PSR matters, where there's extensive use of experts from both sides to back up the allegations being brought by the regulator, by an independent body or independent expert, and I think that will only carry on to grow. So I think if there are lessons from Paqueta cases, probably around, can a regulator produce an expert who is in the pay of the regulator alone, without some other people adding independent insight onto that.
Yeah, and I think if you think of any kind of general disputes away from arbitration, or in arbitration as well, you're going to have a court-appointed expert selected by the parties who are going to really give the independence. That's the kind of thing Ankura, I imagine, will be doing.
My only observation on that, I think, my only observation on that is that can make the whole process, not just that bit of it, but the general maturation of this sort of area, is it can make it expensive and time consuming. And in sport, there has always been with governing bodies, with football clubs, there's always been this desire to put the money on the field, if you like, and minimize spend on other things. And I think that is coming under challenge. I think governance, regulatory issues are meaning that football clubs, rights holders and others must spend money on these things in order to make sure that they are upholding the integrity of the sport. And that's tricky. It is presentationally difficult because fans want all the money to be spent on the new striker. And so, that's the way it goes, isn't it?
But that's the compliance side, isn't it? That's the
Yeah.
It's the thing that's not maybe invested in. Certainly when you've got, if your main customer base, it's ultimately it's your fans who's driving the revenue along with, I suppose, TV revenue. Then, so when it comes to investigations and dealing with those and the red flags, you talked about how the world's moved on, obviously, since I mentioned Matthew Le Tissier,
Yep.
and everything's in apps, the betting companies now. How much data sharing is there with betting companies and regulatory bodies and sports clubs about, oh, we've seen something which is slightly odd, we think you should look into it? Are there information sharing channels that are passing between betting companies and regulators and sports clubs? How does that work in practice?
Well, I mean, in my experience, it works extremely well with the regulated betting market. So let's be clear, the regulated betting market, the betting companies have a legal regulatory obligation to pass on to the appropriate sports regulator suspicious activity in the market. And they have self-interest to do that. Let's not forget that the betting companies, if they pay out on a fixed match, are the victim. Financial victim. The sport might be the reputational victim, but the betting company is the financial victim. So they are obliged to do that. They will have MOUs for data sharing with, in tennis, we had hundreds of MOUs on data sharing with betting companies. And then there are other bodies such as the International Betting Integrity Association who act, if you like, as consolidators in the space. So betting is well shared. There are data privacy issues which make it more complicated, and it will be shared with the regulator. It will not be shared necessarily with the club, and it is up to the regulator to decide, depending on the nature of things, whether they want to inform the club or not as to whether or not they have suspicious activity. Now, as you mentioned earlier, there have been cases where the club itself, and there are some quite well-known cases in certain parts of Europe where the club is just a match-fixing organisation in of itself in the lower leagues in some jurisdictions. So, the regulators will take a view on that. And where you have what you normally would find that the betting alerts are copied to. So, for example, in football, tennis has one regulator globally, which I helped set up and run, and it makes life very easy. In football, you have some national associations who have less resources, have less support. So it'd be normal for UEFA to be copied in, and they may decide, depending on the complexity and cross-border issues, UEFA's integrity team in Switzerland may decide to take ownership and run with the case itself because it's sufficiently complex or cross-border that they want to support the National Association in doing that. So all of that's very well established. It works well on the whole. It's more complicated with the sort of grey market and the black market, and obviously the black market, Asian betting, Indian betting, you're not getting any information, and from the sort of slightly more unregulated markets in other jurisdictions, you may get some, but you might not get everything. But on the whole, regulated market, it works very well.
It's good to hear. And when that information comes out, so I think in other sectors, when it comes to fraud, financial crime, let's look at financial services. They'll have their crisis playbook. They'll know what to do if a fraud is suspected. They'll have quite mature ethics programs in manufacturing and certainly global manufacturing, whistleblowing, and so on. And they'll know their options: court powers, disclosures, injunctions, and so on. Obviously, we've had the corporate criminal liability improve for fraud in recent months with the failure to prevent fraud offence. And I was interested about how the sports sector and football clubs, as we're staying on topic, but other maybe wider sports in the UK are reacting to the failure to prevent fraud offence and taking their reasonable procedures to prevent fraud. And obviously that's about causing a fraud offence against an external party, not fraud within the club. but
Yeah.
external. So how have you seen the clubs approaching Ankura? How have you seen organisations saying, well, what do we do about this?
Well, I would need to sort of probably defer my answer to that question, and speak to my colleagues a bit. I would say, as far as sport is concerned at the moment, I'm not entirely sure that really the sector's fully realised what's happening in this sense, and what this will mean for them. But you're right. As I understand it, it will mean that there is a duty to report counterparty fraud, and we talked about some interesting cases earlier on where counterparties are getting involved in providing loans backed by asset belonging to the club or other things that are going on. So I'm not sure quite whether the sector is fully sort of across it. Those clubs that are well run, and there are many, as I said earlier
Yes.
on, they will already have mechanisms in place for checks and balances and whistleblowing line, and so on. That that will already be there in some of the best run clubs. So it's perhaps in those clubs that haven't quite either got those mature structures in place for whatever reason. And there may be two reasons. One is you've got a slightly bad actor of an owner who doesn't want anybody to be asking them awkward questions. Or two, the club isn't investing in these things because they want to buy that striker. we came back to that. So there are reasons why clubs may not have in place, and smaller clubs, they find all this difficult. I mean, they're very nervous about the independent football regulator. If you're a national league club, what does this mean for you? Or it's compliance and everything else. Eyes start rolling a bit, to be frank. So I know the IFR is going to take a graduated approach. I know it's going to do a lot more, put much more burden at the top, and then have a risk-based approach as you go down the pyramid. And I would think it would, in its corporate governance guidelines in football, at least, which I think people are waiting to see what those are, but it's going to take account of current and future legislation. We talked about EU AML rules, duty to prevent, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because some sectors are quite advanced in looking at how they could be cut up in third-party fraud, and others, it sounds like the sports sector has got somewhere to lean into on that. Just rounding up really on protecting rising talent. I've picked out older kind of quotes and stories, and I remember these are two older ones as well to provide a context of where we've come to today. So I read a quote from back in about 2011-12. This was Michel Platini back then. And he said, football, like most sporting disciplines, is in mortal danger. The very essence of our sport is based on the integrity of results from school sport up to the World Cup. Obviously, the credibility of every competition is affected. Today, there is not a week that goes by without newspaper headlines with a speaker for suspicion, inquiry, and arrest in relation to integrity. And then in athletics, Dwayne Chambers, the British sprinter, he wrote in his book that he hated that he had to cheat. He was in a conversation with Victor Conte of Balco, which I think was part of the whole coaching group for him, and he was encouraged to try the new synthetic substance THG. Chambers challenged Conte and said, "Is it banned? Is it prohibited? Isn't it cheating?" And Conte said, "They're cheating you, Dwayne. You're a talented athlete and you're not competing on a level playing field. Most of the top sprinters are on steroids. Every time you race, you're at a disadvantage." So if you've, I know Michel Platini was acquitted, no charges were levied, but and issues were raised, and so there's no slight on him. And Dwayne Chambers making the point, but if you've got leadership getting caught up with these issues, and you've got young athletes being pressured by senior coaches in this area, how do you go about protecting, as you say, the victims, the young sports people at a young age, from being caught up in manipulation of sports, manipulation of their matches, or for their clubs?
Yep. Great question. And to me, it was one of the absolutely pivotal things we did in tennis. So prior to setting up the International Tennis Integrity Agency, you had an organization before that called the TIU, Tennis Integrity Unit, which was essentially a police force. And it would come down on players like a ton of bricks. But it was taking that approach. What we tried to change in setting up the ITI was to be led by education, information, and support for athletes, and so putting a lot more emphasis on prevention rather than cure. And I think other sports have done this to varying degrees of success. It costs money, so we're back to the striker problem, but it costs money to do this. But certainly tennis absolutely invested across the 7 governing bodies of world tennis in this. So to the extent that you cannot play professional tennis now if you have not done your mandatory education training. So there is no possibility of tennis players saying, I didn't know that you can't insert, bet on tennis or take these drugs or, leave a match early, competition early with turning up for my game with my bags packed, which, for the courtsiders is what they call a clue that you're going to lose that game. So education for me is absolutely key. And, I've talked a lot about Moses Swaby on this. It's a brilliant book, and he is a fantastic young man who went wrong, but he is now used by, I know, the FA and I think FIFA and UEFA as well, to go in. He's a young black man, and he goes in from a deprived background of South London. He goes into football clubs and he talks to people who look at him and see themselves, and they don't want to listen to me. They want to listen to people who look like them, talk their language. So Moses goes in. It's an apocryphal story, isn't it? I've come here from jail to tell you about where I went wrong. So I think cautionary tales, education, support, all of those things are investments that all sports need to be making to make sure that they protect the integrity of their sport, and they support players who are definitely going to come under pressure from bad actors, often, as I say, very sophisticated approach. So we said in tennis, if you think you've got a sponsorship deal that just a bit too good to be true, bring it to us. And we will tell you, is this a genuine sponsor? Are they offering you a genuine deal or not? That type of support's really essential. And tennis is more complicated because the players are not employees, they're individuals. Football clubs I know are doing a lot on this, encouraged by people like the FA who are likewise doing a lot to help. But you can't have enough of this stuff. And I would like to see more athletes who have gone wrong coming back and helping out in this area, because, as I say, I think that's the most powerful story. It's you look like me, you come from the same background as me, same ethnicity, what have you. I see you in me, and I'm listening to you more than perhaps old guys like me.
Yeah, I agree. Apart from the comment about the old guys like you, but I think also hearing from somebody about, look what I've lost, what I could have come to, and maybe not just financial, but just in terms of great stories to be able to tell about competing on the pitch.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was going to say, Jonny,
do we have any questions? I think we've got about 5 minutes to go.
Yeah, I've got one question which links to a Sheffield Wednesday fan, and I'm going to ask a question kind of joined up with that.
Okay.
You talk about training, this education for younger sports people, and that's where the question went. What about education for those coming into football ownership, or those who are at the board or the senior leadership teams in clubs? That's what you'd have in other organisations. So here, the Sheffield Wednesday fan has said, it's all very triggering. I had a similar question. Can an independent regulator actually have any teeth? Or is it a political PR exercise? That's the question. But I was wondering, well, could they have more teeth if they said, well, it's mandatory, you have to go through this in-person training on these types of issues we've talked about today, because if we ever find out later, we can come back to this point of training and nothing was really flagged. I think you're meant to do a self-appraisal form as well, aren't you, in some part of the owner's test? So
yeah, so it's a good question, and the question, are they a paper tiger? Let's see. Let's see. The jury's out on this, and people have different views on it. So we'll see. Look, one of the things they're going to do, and I mentioned it previously, is they are going to set out a code of best practice, best governance for football clubs, and I would expect that to see to show in it that mandatory training on certain things is required for all employees. And look, I work for a large company, global company. Many of the people will do. We go through our mandatory. All employees were doing our ABC training, anti-bribing corruption training. We're doing our data compliance training. We're doing our harassment training in the workplace. But we all have to do this. And I would see sport, well-run sports clubs. Many do this already, but if they don't, I think they're going to have to. And I would suspect there'll be further, as part of the ABC training, there'll be a module on duty to report, potentially, as we talked about, and other things like that. So, the regulator's got a great opportunity here to really, improve the governance, and that's what it's here for, to improve the governance of football in the English pyramid. And I wish it well. There's work to be done, no doubt about it. But I think it has, by and large, the backing. Whether it's quite got the budget, I think the budget, we'll see whether that budget is sustainable. But it's got government behind it, so if it needs more money, it will have more money. I mean, one of the things that, having been a regulator, I can tell you the variable you never know from one year to the next is your legal fees, and they are what they're going to be, depending on the nature of matters. So hopefully there is some understanding in DCMS that if they get involved in very complex matters that require a lot of legal support, that's going to be understood and paid for.
Brilliant. Well, John, that's absolutely flown by. Thank you so much for giving up an hour of your time, and also Ankura, allowing you to come and chat to me. It's really, really great. And thank you to everyone who's attended, either watching this on playback or you've stuck around for the whole session today. Really grateful. You will have sent to you after the event, but also there's a link in the chat in relation to a feedback form. You could fill that in. That really helps us try to work out what people want to hear about next and from who. You'll get this ebook copy recording as well sent out to you. We'll ask if you'd like. We've recently set up a Tenet at the Coalface LinkedIn page. If you can follow that, you can find out about our previous episodes, previous learning books as well. Our next episode is going to be on the 27th of April at 1 p.m. It's going to be with a former press secretary of one of our former prime ministers, who's going to talk about crisis management and what to do if fraud is discovered in your company, and how to deal with the whole crisis PR piece and dealing with regulators. And that is really it from us. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I hope it's been useful, and hopefully see you on the next episode and we can stay in touch. Jonny, thank you so much again for your time.
Not at all. You're welcome. Thank you.